Welcome everyone to the Midnite Power webinar on updating the battery firmware and the inverter firmware with the direct computer connection, and also using the BMS tools software with a direct computer connection. We'll be talking about doing a direct connection to the equipment with a laptop computer, and reasons why you might go this route is if you've got an inverter that's not connected to the internet, if you've got batteries that are not used with a Midnite all-in-one inverter, and for diagnosis of battery problems, even if you do have the inverter connected to the internet and are using the batteries with the Midnite all-in-one inverter. If you're just upgrading firmware and you've got your inverter connected to the internet, it's a lot more straightforward and easy to do the firmware updates just using the service portal, and you can do all the batteries at once and do the inverter easily through the service portal. But if you don't have that internet connection, an off-grid system, or you're using batteries without our inverter, that's where you'll want to do the laptop connection directly to the equipment. Reasons why you might want to update the firmware: if you've got the PowerFlow 16 batteries in a potentially cold location, they need to be on 522 or higher for the firmware version, and this is pretty much late 2025 is when they started shipping with that, so any newer or older ones in that will likely be on 515 or 510 and do need to be updated for the heaters to work properly. It also has some more advanced BMS calibration procedures in 522 and higher. 523 is the latest version as of November 2025. PowerFlow 5 batteries are just fine on the earlier firmware versions. So far there's no major updates to really be of need to update them. You can update them to 523 if you want, but they don't really need it like the PowerFlow 16s do. Latest version for the inverter is 700 for the master and 7B1 for the CSB. That being said, if you're off grid and the firmware is not causing any issues, there's no real need to update it past 406 and 407. So if you've been running it and it runs fine and does everything you need, you don't have to upgrade the firmware on the inverter. We do have some special firmware for lead acid batteries, so if that's the case you're working on, contact support to get that firmware and update it that way. Connecting the computer to the batteries or to the inverter, you'll need a Windows computer. It is a Windows only program. It will run on Windows 10 or 11. I've only had luck getting it to run properly on Windows 10. Other people have only had luck getting it to run properly on Windows 11. So I'm not sure what to make of that. In theory, it should run on either, and we have people running it on either, but sometimes it's picky. You'll need a USB to RS-232 serial adapter, and then it will need RJ45 jacks on the end. That's your Ethernet looking jack to go to the batteries, and a DB9, which is the old serial port connector from 25-30 years ago, to go to the inverter. Midnite has a kit with this little gold colored converter which has all the cables pre-made, or you can just buy the pieces online and make your own connections with the appropriate pinouts. They are in the manuals. It's a lot easier if you just have us send you the thing, especially if you're installing. We'll be using this a bit. Just give us a call or email support and we can send you one of these adapters for use. For the batteries, there's two different pinouts depending on which type battery you have. The PowerFlow 5s have what's labeled a console port, and that's the RS-232 connection. and the cable in our adapter will be labeled PF5. For the PowerFlow 16s, there's two different versions. The newer ones have an RS-232 port, and they use that same cable, which is labeled PowerFlow 5 on the adapter. The older, the Midnite Solar branded versions, and some of the earlier Midnite Power branded versions, they only have 3 ports. They have a combo port that has everything in the same port, because none of them use all 8 pins of the RJ45, so all of them just use different pins of it. So on those, the CAN port is the one that you'll plug into, and it's a little different pin out, so it's got a different cable labeled PowerFlow 16. But if you've got a later PowerFlow 16 that has 4 ports on it instead of 3, then it'll have a dedicated RS-232 port, and you'll use the cable marked PowerFlow 5. It doesn't hurt anything if you use the wrong cable for these, so if it doesn't work, you can just switch it and try the other one. I've found when I built my own converter with just a random RS-232 to USB off the Amazon, I found that the transmit and receive pins on my converter were mislabeled, and I had to swap them versus what's shown in this in order to get it to work. You'll need the software. This is downloaded from our shared drive under Tools, Firmware, and Battery Firmware. There's 3 folders in here. You'll want to grab all 3 folders. 2 of them just have the firmware for the different batteries, and one of them has a whole bunch of other stuff in there. If you download it as a folder, it'll just come in as a zipped file, and then you unzip it, all the folders will be in there that it needs to work properly. There's 2 different programs in there. Under the BMS check tool folder, you'll see LZH lowvolttool.exe, and this is the program to run for checking the BMS status and cell voltages. There's another folder called firmware update tool, and this has LZH lowvoltupdatetool.exe. This is the program for updating battery firmware. There's also a folder in there called 232 drive, and that's the driver for the RS-232 adapter. On my computer, since I use it all the time for serial port connections to various equipment, it just recognized the adapter and I didn't have to install that. But if you haven't been using serial port adapters on your computer before, you'll probably need to install that driver. When you open the BMS check tool, this is what you'll see. Over here on the right side, you'll see a green light. That'll be red initially. You'll need to select which COM port you're using, and then this will say open serial. Click on that and it'll connect. The way to check to see if it really connected is not that this turns green, because it'll connect even if it didn't, or it'll turn green even if it didn't properly connect. You'll want to hit get version right here, and this will populate. If this box down here under current software version doesn't populate, that means it didn't really connect and there's something wrong with the cabling. It'll also populate all the rest of these values here, but some of those can be phantom sometimes, so checking whether it populates the software is the true way to see if you're really connected. Once it grabs all the information from the battery, up in the top left corner here, you'll see kind of an overview. How full is the battery, what voltage, things like that, what current is going on right now. Down here we have, for each of the 16 cells in the battery, we have both in tabular form and a bar graph form, what is the voltage. You can quickly see, do I have some cells that are out of balance with other cells, or are they all pretty much the same? In the middle we have all of our alarms and protections for the BMS. This is often where we want to look if our battery won't charge or won't discharge or has an alarm light on. Why is that BMS unhappy? So you'll see it gives all these different alarms and protections. Alarms is just something's out of the proper range, and protection means it's shut off some function of the battery based on that. Just a notation for what all of these acronyms mean. Over voltage, under voltage for either the entire pack or just an individual cell. Over current, over temperature, under temperature, and discharge and charge can independently be turned on and off by the BMS. So you can look in there and see what's going on with the battery. If you've got a battery that's misbehaving, often we'll ask you to connect the tool to it and see what is the BMS reporting so we can diagnose more what's wrong. Did it just get out of calibration? Does it need some balancing? The PowerFlow 5s especially only balance at full capacity. That's like most lithium batteries on the market. So if you don't regularly get them up to 100% to balance the cells over time, you can have one cell get out of balance, and that cell might be shutting off the battery even though the overall battery's doing okay. The PowerFlow 16s have active balancing, and they're a bit less prone to the cells getting out of balance because they balance at the whole range of state of charges, not just when they're full. But with PowerFlow 5s, especially if they're not wired really correctly, they can get out of balance, and that can be an issue. And this will let you see that. Up here, we've got the temperature of the pack, and it's got 6 different temperature sensors. These are not just cells 1 through 6. These are scattered throughout the 16 cells. So it's 6 different spots in the battery pack, and it's normal to have some variation between those. Over on the right side here, we've got a couple things which are not used in this software. These are on a different version of it, which is used for actually programming the BMS, and that's only for the factory to use. I don't even have access to that because if you program it wrong, you can very quickly damage the battery, definitely void the UL listing, and possibly make it unsafe if you've programmed the wrong parameters into the BMS. So that's why the version that we release for everyone to use is basically read-only. You can't actually program the BMS just because that introduces way too many potentials for destroying the battery. For updating the firmware on the battery, we use the other program. One thing to realize is that when you're doing a serial port connection, you have to close the previous program to open up that serial port for the next one to use. You can't leave both of them connected at the same time, or else the second one won't connect. So you want to close to the previous program for the BMS tool, and then open the firmware update tool. It's pretty much similar. You're going to select your port here. Don't mess with the baud rate. And then you'll hit open serial. It'll go green. And then check where it says current software version. That needs to populate there to let you know that it's really connected. To update the firmware, first you're going to want to download the files onto your computer from our shared drive. And then you'll hit load file right here, and that's where you load the file into the software from the hard drive. Then hit start download, and that downloads the file from the software into the battery. It will have a status here of what it's doing, how many packages it sent to the battery, and the status bar crawling across here. When it's done, it'll update and say the new version right here under current software version. It takes a few minutes for each battery. If you've got a whole bunch of batteries, the newest ones may be able to be updated all at once, but most of the older batteries and it's just usually better practice to do this for all of them, is disconnect all of the batteries and update them one at a time, connecting to each one, updating it, and disconnecting and moving to the next one, and then reconnect all the battery comm cables and put it back together in a whole bank. If you do this, you'll have to shut all the batteries down and then turn them on one by one as you connect to them. And then when you're done, shut them all back down, reconnect the battery comm cables, and turn the master battery back on, which will turn the whole bank back on. Similar process for the inverter, only we're going to use the DB9 connector, and we remove the dongle, which is where we hook the Ethernet cable or Wi-Fi to the inverter. Remove that, and there's a DB9 port in there, and that's where you connect the cable coming out of the RS-232 adapter. You want to grab the software under Tools, Firmware, Inverter Firmware, and it's just a standalone file, not a whole folder like with the battery ones. You want to connect to the inverter. You'll pick your COM port up here and then connect, and then you want to go down here in the bottom and hit check versions only. That will verify that you've connected, and if it's working correctly, it'll populate this section that says versions before upgrade. That'll show you all the versions that are currently on the inverter. Then you'll want to go to this one that says choose file, and that'll let you choose the file on the hard drive. Again, grab those files for the firmware updates off of the shared drive. And then hit start for upgrade control, and it will update the file. Make sure you keep this checked automatically here, because that means that it automatically checks and sends that file to the right processor in there. If you set that to manual, it can get all confused and be difficult to get figured out. So make sure that stays checked automatically so it sends the file to the right processor. There's generally 2 processors, sometimes 3, that need to be updated with new firmware. Your main DSP or MDSP, your CSB, also called the EMS MCU right here, and the slave DSP. The other ones, we almost never update the firmware. We haven't since release. One thing to realize when you're doing these firmware updates, and this is the same whether you're doing it over the portal or the direct connection, is when you're doing the CSB firmware update, you want to make sure that the inverter does not lose power from its DC battery connection. What we've had issues with is people doing these upgrades in their shop before taking inverters out to the field, and they just quick clamp some alligator cables onto the battery terminals of the inverter. If it's not a really good connection and that inverter sees the battery power flicker partway through the CSB upgrade, it will brick the inverter, and we don't have replacement boards for that particular board yet. So don't do that. Make sure that you've got battery cables actually bolted onto those terminals, even if you're just doing a temporary connection in the shop to fire it up and update the firmware before you take it into the field. While it's doing the update, you'll see the status bar going across, and you'll see kind of a status of what's going on. And then after the update, this section right here where it says versions after upgrade, those will populate with the new ones, and once you see the new versions in there, you know that you've gotten your update done. And that's it. If you've got any questions, email me at zeke@midnitepower.com or support@midnitepower.com, and we can help answer questions. Also, if you need one of the adapters for the USB to these specialized pieces that go out to the batteries and the inverter, email support@midnitepower.com and we can send you an adapter. That's a normal part of your toolkit as an installer, and we want to support you there. We will see you later. Thanks.